Okay, today God is leading me to talk about the question, what does it mean to live a good life? And that can be a difficult question for me to answer for two reasons. One, because there's two different ways of answering it. There's a philosophical way of answering it, and there's a Christian way of answering it. And the two ways of answering it can appear different, even if they're similar in a lot of ways. The second reason it's difficult for me to talk about is because I've yet to really develop the vocabulary around it sufficiently. I'm used to writing about it, and I'm not used to speaking about it. And speaking about the good life and writing about the good life are really two different tasks. But God is leading me to talk about this today, so that's the direction I'm going to go. I'm gonna try to approach it philosophically first, and then if I have time, we'll approach it from the Christian perspective. Philosophically speaking, I think the good life can be broken down into two large aspects, and there's a lot of details in these two overarching aspects, but these two aspects I think are the most foundational or crucial. The first is authenticity. And the second is freedom, specifically the freedom to act on one's authenticity. Now, what do I mean by authenticity? Essentially, what I mean by authenticity is that I believe that we all have a true self and a false self. Our true self is who we really are. Our true self is what we really desire and what would really fulfill us and what would really bring us purpose, happiness, joy, satisfaction, all those kinds of good things. And the false self is everything we have to become in order to survive in the world and to get along. And the true self and the false self, they come into conflict with one another all the time. Pretty much from the beginning of your life. Pretty much since the moment that you've been born, the false self and the true self are trying to sort of battle it out with one another. Because your true self, it's focused on happiness. Your true self is focused on what do I really want out of life and what do I really value out of life. The true self is trying to experiment with your life to figure out what really makes you happy and to sort of test ideas, you could say, about what makes you happy by motivating you to go out and seek what it's prompting you to seek. The false self is trying to keep you alive. The false self is trying to make sure that you are able to get along with people, are able to function in your society, are able to maintain your relationships with your family, with your friends, with your coworkers, with your religious faith, with your group members. And these come into conflict all the time. Most people have the experience of what's called masking, which is where who they are socially can be a lot different from who they are when they're by themselves. And again, this comes out of survival mechanism. Back in the day, for our ancestors, if you didn't get along with your community, if you didn't get along with your tribe, they might just kill you, or at the very least, they'd ostracize you, and you would really be cut off from resources. And if they kicked you out, even if they didn't outright kill you, if they kicked you out of the tribe and just left you to fend for yourself, the likelihood that you were going to be able to survive on your own was very low. We evolved as social creatures. We survived as tribes and groups. And so if you weren't able to conform to one degree or another with your group, you are in great danger. And so, very often, I would say most of the time, our ancestors had to suppress or repress their own individual desires in order to survive. And in fact, children in particular were trained. I mean, we call this socialization today, but they were trained to be able to survive the social environment that they were in, in order to gain cooperation of the other people, in order to be taken care of. There wasn't a lot of opportunity for real authenticity in our ancestors' time. There wasn't really a lot of opportunity to be oneself and to go after one's internal authentic desires back in the day. If Timmy if Timmy wanted to be an artist, but Timmy was a serf in the Middle Ages working the fields, and his parents needed him and needed his help in order to grow the crops so that the whole family wouldn't starve. Then Timmy's parents are going to make Timmy work the field regardless of whether or not Timmy wants to be an artist. And so Timmy has to work the fields. He can't pursue his authentic desires, not only because it would threaten his physical survival, but because it might bring him threat from his parents. His parents might mistreat him, or they might cut him off from food, or they might try to discipline or use force against him in some way in order to force him to do what they think he needs to do. And there are a variety of mechanisms, not just with families, but with society that push back against our authenticity, who we really are, for the sake of pressuring us into social roles or social survival. We spend a lot of our life doing what, at the very least, we think we have to in order to get along with everybody else and to survive. We have to spend still today an inordinate amount of time dedicated to survival and dedicated to social interaction. Now, I don't want to act like those things aren't, valuable to us. I mean, spending time with our family, spending time with our community, these can all be wonderful things. It's just to illustrate this tension between who we are and what we really want and what we have to do in order to get along and survive. And it's to illustrate how early this tension becomes. It's to illustrate how early the pressures of family and of social expectations, the expectations of your peers, of your teachers, of your extended family, of the different kinds of authorities in your life shape and mold your understanding of who you are from a very early age without you really understanding what's going on. And for a lot of people, they might go their entire lives without really breaking down the kind of false self layers that have been placed on top of them to get access to their, what I would call their instinctual self, their true self, what they innately desire and want out of life. Some of this peeks through, and some of it peeks through by getting repackaged in another way. But there is always this tension between the false self and the true self. And I also don't want to imply in that distinction that the true self is the good self and the false self is the bad self. It's not, I'm really not making a value judgment necessarily between them. In a lot of circumstances, the false self is necessary in order for us to survive. But there is this tension between happiness and survival. Even though survival takes up so much of our time and our energy in life, we don't live just to survive. We don't live just to live. We don't just live for another day. We live for the sake of something. We survive for the sake of something. And the thing that we survive for the sake of is whatever that value is, whatever that understanding or idea of our happiness and our fulfillment and our authentic self is. You can kind of get an idea of your authentic self if you ask yourself seriously, if I didn't have to work for the rest of my life, what would I do? Who would I be? What would I go after? How would this change how I interact in the world? That can get you at least a little bit closer to your authentic self, though there's still a layer of false self resistance even there because you've been trained from an early age to be afraid of your true self, because there's a sense in which if you were your true self from the very beginning, it would threaten your survival, your physical survival and your social survival. There's a degree to which there is an underlying anxiety, an underlying fear that is associated with real authenticity because there's actually a real survival threat underneath there. And not only that, but again, we come out of an evolutionary history where to be authentic could put us in great danger. And conformity was something that allowed us psychoevolutionarily to survive. And yet, it's the authentic self, the true self, which is the source of all of our purpose. It's the source of all of our meaning. It's the source of that thing which fulfills us and which drives us to survive in the first place. Without the authentic self, all we have is just the pure desire, or not even the desire, the pure impetus to live for the sake of living, which is a dead end. It's our authentic self, the self that is revealed when we don't have to conform and we don't have to spend all this time on the basis of survival. It's that authentic self which actually gives our life meaning. And it shows up differently for different people. That's why I'm hesitating to give very specific examples of what it means to be authentic, because it is a largely subjective thing, meaning that everybody has different values, different innate drives, different innate things that makes their life meaningful in a unique way. But everybody has the experience of this tension between who they are and what they have to be in order to survive. The reason why authenticity is so important to the idea of a good life is that the good life is very much wrapped up in, can I achieve my values? Can I become what I am supposed to be, not what I have to be? The meaning in our life, again, coming from a philosophical point of view here, the meaning of our life is, can I be who I am supposed to be? Can I be the person who would really fulfill me, who would really give my life meaning, who would really allow me to have purpose? And that meaning and that purpose, it can involve other people. It's only to say that our true self or our values, they come from us, from our innate authentic self, and they come into competition with what we have to do in order to survive, both socially and physically. But because it's the center of all of our meaning and our purpose, it's the first major ingredient of what it means to live a good life. The second major ingredient is, I guess you could call it more socially oriented, or it's not necessarily about yourself or about your authentic self, but this is freedom. And basically, the way I try to describe this simply is, as much as we talk about authenticity being important for a meaningful life, at the same time, we need to be free to act for the sake of that authentic self in the world. And part of that is individually focused, part of that is confronting needless inauthenticity, confronting the fear that comes with being authentic in the world, especially in the modern world where we are not so socially constrained as we used to be, but a lot of the evolutionary fear and anxiety is still there, or confronting how we were trained to be as children, because a lot of anxiety and fear can come from our childhood training of inauthenticity. But even just thinking in a basic social or even political way, we also need to be free to act for the sake of what we value in the world. When we think about what this means, I think that we should think that what this means is to be free as far as is possible from force. Another way of putting this is something like a world in which everybody can act for the sake of who they really are is by definition a world that is free from force. Now, I know that our world is not free from force, not politically, not personally, but when you think of a lot of the major crimes, when you think of murder and sexual assault and theft and a lot of the major immoralities that we think of, they all involve this element of force. And in fact, they're really in some ways defined, or they're made to be immoral by the element of force. So you think of something like theft. Someone that takes your money by force, we call it theft and we think it's wrong. But if I voluntarily give money to somebody who asks me, then it's called charity. It's almost a complete moral opposite of theft, is something like charity, right? And so, what turns that transfer of money from moral to immoral at the foundation, there's other elements involved, but at the foundation is force. And I think it's the same way with a lot of other kinds of immorality that we experience. And I think, again, it goes back to this idea that to actually be able to live out the meaning of our lives, we have to be able to act for the sake of it. And to be able to act for the sake of what we value, we must be free to act on what we value. And when other people use some kind of physical force or coercion against us, we are, by definition, unable to act for the sake of what we value. And some people would say, well, sometimes it's good to prevent people from acting on what they authentically want to value. For instance, doing any of those immoral things or any of those crimes that I mentioned. But again, I think the vast majority of those crimes can be defined by force or coercion itself. And so these two elements, authenticity and freedom from physical force or coercion, actually work together. And the kind of world in which everybody could be authentic, again, is the kind of world that is entirely free from physical force. It's also that same world that is free from physical force and coercion is the same world that is free from all of the most heinous crimes that we can really think about. And so if you're talking about this at an individual level, you're talking about the idea of freedom from an individual level, you can say that part of what it means to live a good life, besides being authentic, is to actually refrain from using physical force or coercion in any scenario where it's not absolutely necessary. And even in situations, for example, like self defense, to try to use as much minimal force as possible to sort of restore things back to where they were before anything happened, right? And so these two elements, authenticity, being able to act for the sake of who you are, and battling against the needless inauthenticity, the needless false self that pops up and fills us with unjustified fear and anxiety, that's one central element. But then the sort of worldwide freedom from physical force and coercion, which boils down to the individual refraining from the use of physical force in their daily life. These two combined together would be the major pillars, if you would, of the good life from a philosophical perspective. And I say the main pillars because they're not the only thing that would be involved in the good life. The reason being is because there's another element involved, which it's traditionally called virtue, and I just tend to call it virtue. So the discussion that we just had about authenticity and freedom from force, this would sit more in the realm of morality because it's has a much broader universal application. Whereas as we enter into the discussion of virtue, which is another branch of ethics, both morality and virtue are branches of ethics, normative ethics in particular. But as we enter into the conversation of virtue, we run into a bit of a limitation here because much of the discussion around virtue is not universal. It depends on what the values are. But I'm sort of getting a little bit ahead of myself, kind of explaining this third element, which I don't think is as crucial as authenticity and freedom, but is still a really important element in the good life. That's virtue. And the way that I understand virtue is the question of, given X value, what is the best way to go about achieving it in the world? Given who I am, given my circumstances, given my abilities, whatever it is, my resources, whatever it is, what is the best way to go about achieving this value or this thing I want or this goal that I have? And when you break it down like that, virtue seems to be very situational and subjective, and to a large degree it is. But there are certain things that you can point out, certain qualities, if you will, certain character traits that have, if not a universal character, then they have a near universal character, which is to say that for most goals, these kinds of virtues benefit that. One classic one is honesty. People say you should tell the truth, you should be honest. And of course, there are classic arguments against the goodness of always telling the truth. For instance, if somebody came to your door and said, "Hey, I'd like to, kidnap your wife. Can you tell me where she is?" That would be a situation in which you'd probably lie, right? You probably wouldn't be honest and you'd probably try to deceive the kidnapper as much as possible because you don't want to give him the information that's going to enable him to do something wrong. You want to withhold that, right? And that's pretty obvious. But does that mean that the statement you should try to be honest in your life is bad advice or honesty is not a good character trait or honesty is not a virtue? Well, no. The reason being is that a desire for the truth, a desire for honesty is in most circumstances and for most goals a ability that allows you and the other people around you to understand the reality of the situation, right? The truth of the situation, the truth of who you are and they are and how your interests align and how you can actually go about achieving things in the world. If you're in a business relationship, it's very often the case that it's important to have an honest relationship because in the long run, that's going to be able to make the business better, more efficient, more able to actually achieve its goal. And the virtue of honesty is one of those virtues where, in most circumstances, it's valid. It holds true. But in some other circumstances, it's not always good. Authenticity is always something good. Freedom is always something good. But something like honesty as a character trait is not always a good thing. And there's a variety of these kinds of circumstances, like wisdom and like courage, where in a lot of circumstances you can understand these being valuable traits to have. But in a few other circumstances, you can understand how they don't have a universal validity to them. And there's a whole class of these kinds of character traits or ways of going about life that fall into this category of virtue that are important for people to think about in terms of a toolbox. And they're the toolbox on how to go about life in the most successful way. But you have to think about them very deeply. You have to think about them very seriously in order to be able to use them effectively because they're not good in every kinds of circumstances. And so overall, philosophically, thinking about the good life requires thinking about, well, it requires in the first place that you understand these two pillars that are essential to any kind of good life, which is authenticity and freedom. But then as you try to live out your authentic freedom in the world, you have to be able to seriously think about the many kinds of virtues and character traits that you might want to develop in yourself and in the people around you in order to achieve the kind of authentic freedom that you want and to really allow it to manifest in the world. Now I understand that that was a very basic overview. And I'm also trying to get practice at that. I'm trying to get practiced at simplifying what at sometimes is a complex philosophy when I write it. And this is really a first trial of that. And I also understand I didn't get to the Christian perspective on this question of how to live a good life, which that will make a good part 2 episode. But I think this is a good start and I hope that it gave you a good overview about how I think about the good life.